Welcome to the Be Here Now guest podcast. This series features a collection of teachings and conversations centered around mindfulness, spiritual growth, and living a life in balance. Each week, our diverse network of guest teachers and hosts offer up wisdom and practices from a different spiritual path and perspective. If you would like to support this podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/donate.
If you don't know me, I'm Jackie Dobrinska. I'm the Director of Education and Community for Love, Serve, Remember. And I also get to host that podcast, so maybe you've heard me that way. But you're this thing that we're playing and exploring, the Ram Dass Explorers Club. We started it because so many people came to Ram Dass through psychedelics, or there's this other way that people have come to open to psychedelics through some of Ram Dass's teachings. And so either way, we wanted to create a place where we could talk about the things we don't always talk about, create a curious, open-hearted, ever-evolving space to talk about the intersection of psychedelics, science, and creativity. And we named the group the Explorers Club because Ram Dass would talk about the old Explorers Club, about him and Leary and that whole group. And like any explorers, we're never going to arrive anywhere and we're never going to figure it all out. We just keep diving into these non-ordinary states. And I always remind people that psychedelics are one of the wonderful ways we can experience non-ordinary states. But there's that great story Ram Dass told of the woman who totally got there through crocheting. She totally understood what he was talking about, and her path through was crocheting. So got to keep that in mind. So tonight we're gonna do our best to learn from each other, share insights, and deepen our understanding together. So why don't we? That's enough of me talking. Let us jump in. This is a music video with Ram Dass and the global-based music producer David Starfire. I don't only have a cold, I have a concussion. So please excuse my fumbly words. Anyway, let's just jump into that. So I invite you to take some nice breaths, find your seat, let go of the distractions and the multitasking. Just sort of let this wash over you. Let this be a nourishing presence that sort of brings us into the moment together.
My name is Ram Dass, and I would like to share with you a meditation of the heart. Now let's begin. Bring your awareness to the middle of your chest. Imagine that there is a hole in the middle of your chest through which you are breathing, as if there were nostrils or a nostril there. So you're breathing in and out through the center of your chest. And as the love pours into your chest, it is like a liquid. It fills you. It pours through your entire body, up through to the top of your head. Inside of you are the residues of so many experiences. Some of these residues are beautiful, loving, harmonious. They are harmonious with the love that is pouring into you. But others of these residual bits left over from the experiences of your life are harsh, are negative. They're things like frustration, anger, inadequacy, loneliness, unworthiness, self-pity. Let this liquid love that is pouring into you with the in-breath wash through you and dislodge all these little tensions that hold on, all of the sadness and the loneliness. We all have it. Let it be dislodged. And as you breathe out, let those things pour out of you and offer them. Let your breath be slow and deep. In the in-breath, fill with this liquid love. Let it pour through you, cleaning, scraping, dislodging, loosening. On the out-breath, let all of the impurities, all of the past failures, the fears, the anger, the frustration, all of it, let it pour out. Just give it up. Let it go. And then in the space, once again, breathe in deeply and fill with pure, clear, light love. When you're ready, open your eyes and proceed with your daily life activities. But at any time, whether working or playing or resting, sitting on a subway or bus, whenever, for one moment, focus in the middle of your chest and let the heart alchemy work once again through you.
So taking some deep breaths. Maybe Mongolo will put the link to that in the chat in case you want to watch it again. Hopefully that brought us a little bit more to center, back to ourselves. And so from this place, it always feels strange to move from that meditative space back into head space, but I'm going to gently invite us back because I'm very excited and very honored to welcome a dear friend and colleague, Dr. Ray Turpin, to join us today. He really has been this forerunner in the field of psychedelic assisted therapy, and not just as a researcher and a clinician, but someone who's really dedicated to making this work more accessible and rooted in community care. So he's been on the forefront of healing for decades. He has a background in clinical psychology, in psychiatric crisis work, and community mental health. And he co-founded the Pearl Psychedelic Institute, which was one of only 3 MAPS extended access sites in the country for the MDMA assisted therapy for the treatment of treatment-resistant PTSD. And they were working really to bridge research with real-world application. So very much involved in sort of shaping this next generation of practitioners through that, as well as through these trainings. He's a mentor at the California Institute of Integral Studies, and the Pearl also has an online mentorship program called OM. And he just helps people step into this field with wisdom and integrity and harm reduction and clinical experience. And really working, again, for this more accessible model for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. His CV is long and impressive. I mentioned just a little bit of it. But one of his many, 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 many gifts is his passion and brilliance in being able to bring music to these sessions, and this aspect of creativity that really helps inform a lot of what happens in psychedelic spaces. And so just let's give him a very big, like, sign language applause as we get to hear Dr. Turpin talk about the intersection of psychedelics and creativity. Raymond, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Jackie. I appreciate you having me. And yeah, it was a very nice introduction. I hope I can live up to it. And I appreciate everybody being here tonight. I do enjoy talking about LSD. It is one of the, it was actually the most widely researched psychedelic back during the heyday when you look at the late 40s, 50s, 60s into the early 70s. And so it's got a lot of cultural baggage because of that. And I actually thought that I would not live to see the day when this research actually started back up again, but it actually has started back up again. And it's quite interesting about what's going on, which if we have time, I'll touch on that at the end. What I wanted to talk about tonight was a little bit of just LSD and how it seems to affect creativity and the creative process. There were some interesting sort of forgotten studies that were done back in the 60s that I wanted to unearth a little bit and touch on. And then talk a little bit about what's going on in the brain during an LSD intoxication. And then talking about how that could see how you can lead to novel ideas and creative process being stimulated. And then also wanted to just talk a little bit about, obviously, LSD, when it got out of the lab, it had enormous influences on the arts and in the world, on music, painting, writing, and wanted to just focus a little bit on one of the musical outlets for it, which was the Grateful Dead, which, you know, they were accused in the 80s and 90s of sort of dragging the 60s with them. And I think some of that was true. But I also think that they were creating something that was so beyond. It took what was started in the 60s and really evolved it into this wonderful medium of art that was actually quite participatory with the crowd and people that came to these shows who were also high on psychedelics and most of the time LSD. So I want to touch on that a little bit at the end. So I am going to keep an eye on the clock here. I'm going to try to get through everything. I took a few notes. If I need to skip a few things, Jackie, I'll do my best, but give me the hook sign if I'm getting too late. All right. I'm not going to go too much into the discovery of LSD. That's kind of a fairly common story. But what you need to know is that there was a young chemist in Basel, Switzerland named Albert Hofmann, who was working with various syntheses of ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye and wheat. And what he was doing was he was playing around with variations of derivatives of ergot to try to see if they could find a medication that could be used to stimulate circulation. And so he was sort of systematically going through these derivatives and numbering them. And as he got them, they would test them maybe on animals, and then they'd get shelved, usually unless there was something that was promising. And so in 1938 was when he synthesized what he called LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide 25, and it got shelved. And then 5 years later, in 1943, he had what he called a peculiar presentiment. He had this nagging idea or sensation that there was something he had missed in the 25th. And so when he resynthesized it in the lab, we think he accidentally uploaded a bit of it or got a little bit of it into his fingers, had a little bit of a trip experience. And then on Monday, the 16th of April or the 19th of April, he decided to do the first controlled experiment where he took what he thought was a minuscule dose, but ended up being 250 micrograms, which anybody that's familiar with LSD knows that's a pretty chunky dose. And then he went off and had his famous bicycle ride. They could not figure out what this strange enigma of a chemical was. And so what Sandoz did, which was the laboratory, was they offered basically free samples of LSD to any researcher out there in the world. As long as you sent them a letter that had letterhead on it and said, hey, I'm willing to explore and research this, they would send you a supply of LSD. And the only caveat was that you needed to share with them what your research results were. So this launched this incredible period of exploration into this very strange drug. Started out as what they call a psychotomimetic, a mimicker of madness. They thought it made normal people crazy. And so the idea eventually was to give people LSD to see if they could study psychosis and see if psychosis did have an organic basis. And they thought this could provide maybe a key to understanding schizophrenia and other psychotic illnesses. But the other thing they found was that they started to give it to mentally ill people. And what they found was it seemed to really help these mentally ill people. And so they couldn't figure out what is this thing that makes normal people crazy and crazy people more normal. And so this started this whole research thing that rolled out. And eventually it made it out of the labs. And made it out into the streets and made it out into the culture, which we'll talk a little bit about the impact in the culture. And then finally, about 1966, Sandoz just shut it all down. They pulled all their LSD supplies and said, we're no longer sponsoring this. And pretty much everything came to a screeching halt. The last LSD study in the United States was shut down in 1975 up in Maryland, one of Bill Richards. Bill Richards says he was the last one to walk out of the office and shut the light off. That was the end of psychedelic studies in America until we got to the renaissance that we're seeing right now. LSD was always considered a threat in some ways by the government. Once it got out of the laboratory, it tended to make people question authority, and it also tended to stimulate divergent thinking. And so people were all of a sudden not necessarily following along in lockstep like society likes, and that became very threatening. It led to things like the Vietnam War protests, the environmental movement. It helped fuel things like equal rights, even some of the civil rights movements. There was just a whole upsurge around the late 60s, and they felt like LSD was behind a lot of it. And so that was much of the motivation for shutting down all of the research. But all they did was shut down all the legitimate research. It really didn't do anything to stop the illicit recreational use of it. So there was some folks that were interested in seeing what does this mysterious substance do with the creative process in humans. And the first study was in 1955 by a psychologist named Louis Berlin. And what he did was he gave 4 pretty prominent American graphic designers a dose of LSD and had them produce some art. And then he had art critics take a look at it. And what they said was that even though it was a little bit out there, it wasn't like their normal style that they would see from graphic design artists. There was abstract qualities and things that they felt were really interesting. And so there was something more artistically interesting about what they put out on LSD. And then another study that happened with Dr. Oscar Yaniger, who was practicing in LA, he did this study for 7 years, from 1955 to 1962. And he brought artists in. I think he had probably at least 120 of them that he studied. And he would have them come in and look at what was called a little Kachina doll. I think it was a Hopi Indian Native American doll. And they would paint it sober. And then he would have them take LSD. And then they would paint it while they were high on LSD. And then again, he had art critics, people come in to try to take a look and judge the quality of the art. And what they found with the LSD art, they said, was that, there's some of the precise craftsmanship that these artists normally had definitely suffered a bit, such as, lines, things weren't quite as straight as they normally would expect. But what they found was that it was aesthetically, it had greater aesthetic value. They said that there was greater imagination, there was more evidence of abstract perceptions. And it's very interesting if you go find some of these pictures. They're kind of crazy. You see the doll before and what it looked like on LSD. So it was judged to have, in some ways, greater artistic value because it was such interesting, imaginative perceptions that they were painting. And so one of the most fascinating studies, this is one that not a whole lot of people know about, but Jim Fadiman, who is a psychologist, and Willis Harman, Myron Stolaroff, Robert Mogar, some of these guys had a nonprofit that was based out of Palo Alto, California, called If As. And what they did was they were wondering, the idea was, could you give a moderate dose of LSD, 100 micrograms, in a very safe, supportive setting, and could this stimulate problem-solving abilities? And so what they did was they went and recruited scientists, professionals that were really good in their fields, and in order to qualify for the study, they said, we want you to bring to us a problem, a professional problem that you've been working on in your profession, and we want you to have at least struggled with it for at least 3 months. And it has to have been turned down by either your customer or your supervisor as not being good enough. So they wanted to find these people that were really good at what they did, but that they were tackling a professional problem that they could not seem to surmount after 3 months. And they really wanted people that were emotionally involved in what they were working on and had, by 3 months or longer, had developed what they considered to be some emotional blocks to be able to get to the creative side of to try to solve these issues. And so this study took place generally around late 65, 66 in Menlo Park, California. They ended up looking at 27 professionals. Most of them were scientists. And what they did was they said, bring in these problems. And then they would have a day where they were given 100 micrograms of LSD. And then they were given 3 hours from 9 to noon to just lay there with their eyes closed, listening to music. And then from 12 to 1, they popped up and had to do some psychological assessments, which they all did. And then for the next 4 hours, they were left alone and they were encouraged to just dive into the problems that they've been working on. And like I said, there was 27 professionals in all. These were all but two of these folks had all but two had no previous psychedelic experience. So only 2 people had ever had any experience before. And there were 16 engineers, a physicist, 2 mathematicians, 2 architects, a psychologist, a furniture designer, a commercial artist, and a sales manager and a personnel manager. And again, these were people that were, kind of really good at what they did. And these were just problems that had really been causing them issues in their work. And so what they found was this incredible ability in all of them to be able to solve these problems. They all were able to find novel solutions to these problems that they had been trying to work on. And what they said was that there were it wasn't so much that the LSD gave them increased technical skills. What it did was it gave them the ability to go through rapid alternatives, and they could consider rapid ideas that could come. And so they still felt like the end result was nothing that was outside what their skill set was, but their ability to get to the problem and to cut through it and to see the solution was what was so phenomenal about it. And what they said was the speed of the process was so incredibly accelerated during this. And they found that during the LSD, the way it happened and the way it helped them solve their problems was that it lowered their anxiety and their inhibition. So they were just able to kind of get into the flow and not worry so much about getting stuck in what ifs and things like that. They also said that they were able to hold multiple ideas at one time. There was a faster flow of ideas that came to them. There was also a greater capacity to visualize and imagine what the potential problem was. They found increased concentration and focus, heightened empathy with people and the processes that they were dealing with, and that subconscious data was more accessible. And then in some of the instances, which was pretty amazing, they were able to just see the completed solution. They were able to see this thing in its complete entirety. And so it was very interesting because all of these subjects solved their professional problem that they'd been stuck with for 3 months after 100 milligrams of LSD. And in an interesting, very unplanned result, half of these folks reported experiencing continued heightened abilities for several months afterwards. And there's a list of some of these incredible things that they came up with in their work after the LSD study. And so it was interesting because Fadiman tells the story about they were on their session and they had 4 engineers in there on LSD when a letter showed up, and it was from the FDA and the DEA, and it was telling them to terminate their research immediately, stop immediately. And so they looked at these guys under the eye shades on LSD and they were like, and they put it in the drawer and they said, this letter came tomorrow. And so they were able to get these last folks through. And so they were able to treat 27 of them before the FDA shut down their project and all of the LSD research that was taking place in the United States. And they found that these people, one of the things that helped them was that they were encouraged to believe that the LSD would help them. They were encouraged to believe that it was going to help them come up with ideas quicker. It was going to help them focus. And so there's something about that set and setting, that expectation, that really they feel like had something to do with it. And they had some interesting little prompts for these folks. They were encouraged to not only believe that it was going to work, and that these results and that the experience could be sort of controlled and sort of however they wanted to have it happen. But they were encouraged to ask their deeper selves questions, things like, try seeing the solution. When you look at the problem, try going ahead and seeing the solution. Try asking yourself to be able to see the solution. Identify with the object or the problem or the person that's involved so that you get a different vantage point, a different perspective. And then they also told them that you will likely be able to scan through a ton of ideas much quicker than you normally would. So there was a little bit of expectation there that set the stage for this to be such a successful experiment. And there was another one that was done about 2 or 3 years later when they were able to get permission to do this, very small study. And they took random people and tried to give them LSD and do some creativity tests, and they were very inconclusive. And so what this sort of demonstrated is that, LSD isn't going to necessarily make someone artistic or make someone able to, express. That's what an artist has. An artist is able to not only see the vision, but they have the ability to express it to us. And so LSD didn't necessarily create these abilities to express things, but what they did was it kind of gave these artists and these professionals grist for the mill. And it gave them some things to be able to turn over and give them some ideas for how they could solve these problems. But it was interesting because this random study with people that were just kind of off the street was very inconclusive, and they felt like it was people, they weren't motivated to solve these problems. They weren't motivated to find creative solutions, and so they got some really wonky results. But this one study that Fadiman and Harmon and these folks did in 65, 66 was really pretty phenomenal, and they wanted to do problems that could be kind of a sciencey based thing so they could easily see the results and that the results could be measured. And for anybody interested, that study is published in an old journal called Psychological Reports, and it's from August of 1966, but you can find it on the internet too. LSD also has some other interesting little show-ups in history that have prompted creativity in some prominent folks over the years. Francis Crick, he was a Nobel laureate, a Nobel Prize winner. And what he did was he was working with low-dose LSD. And during a low-dose LSD session, he was able to actually visualize and discover the double helix structure of the DNA molecule. Steve Jobs, he was, the head of Apple and kind of the father of the personal computer. And he said that his LSD trips were some of his most impactful experiences that he had, and that some of the insights he got while on LSD were directly related to later on coming up with some of the designs and ideas for the personal computer. There was also another Nobel Prize chemist. His name was Kary Mullis, and he ended up designing what he won a Nobel Prize for in '93 was called the polymerase chain reaction. And this is used for crime scenes and all kinds of things, but it was a huge discovery. And he actually was not on LSD at the time that he discovered this, although that's kind of the story out there. But what happened was he had been using LSD beforehand, and what LSD had taught him was when he was in an LSD state, it taught him how to literally climb inside a molecule and look around and to be able to see how it was designed. And so he used this skill that he had developed on LSD and used that to invent this polymerase chain reaction. And so that's another little instance where science has benefited from people thinking outside the box and using LSD. There was also another interesting one in the late 50s. There was a Canadian architect. His name was Kiyoshi Izumi. I know that doesn't sound Canadian, but he was Canadian. And he was working with Humphrey Osmond up in Saskatchewan. And they were working in this really decrepit, old, sketchy, old, like crazy hospital. And this guy took LSD and checked out the hospital, and he was able to see it from the perspective of a psychotic patient. And he saw everything, what was scary about it. And so he ended up coming up with revolutionary designs for how to design mental wards, psychiatric hospitals that were much more straight halls. They weren't designed like the old ones. And he got famous for that. But that was thanks to LSD and giving him the vantage point to be able to see what was wrong with how hospitals were being designed and laid out, and was able to give your an ability to show a more improved design. So I want to talk a little bit now about what's going on in the brain. What we do know about LSD is that it does affect several neurotransmitters, but it mainly hones in on the serotonin transmitter, specifically the 5-HT2 transmitter. And what it does is it goes into the brain and it binds to this receptor. And it just doesn't bind and take off. It binds and it locks down. And it locks down and it stimulates this receptor. So you basically have this tidal wave of serotonin building up, which ends up creating these cascade effects and really domino effects into other areas of the brain and other neurotransmitters. But essentially, it allows for, it alters the way the brain communicates. What we see is that when there's an area of the brain that's called the default mode network that some of you guys have probably heard about. It's been implicated oftentimes with psychedelics. And most psychedelics will shut down partially the default mode network, except MDMA does not really work with the default mode network. It's totally different. But the default mode network, very briefly, it's sort of the seat of the ego. It's where your lifetime experiences, the ones that had major emotional charges, or things that happened to you repetitively that taught you who you are, how competent you are, what a failure you are, how you show up in the world, what the world's like. It starts to form your idea of who you are and how you are in the world, how the world sees you. And what we know is that when we are in goal-directed activity, the default mode network is very quiet in the brain. But then when we're not focused on anything externally and we lapse into daydreaming, rumination, self-reflection, that's when we're all in this default mode network. And we find that depressed people and anxious people spend an inordinate amount of time in that default mode network. And so one of the reasons that we're seeing psilocybin be so effective with treatment-resistant depression is it shuts down that default mode network, which is where all that depressive, damaged ego view is. And then it allows all these other areas of the brain to come online. And they think that's essentially part of biochemically the healing mechanism with psilocybin for depression. LSD does a similar thing. When LSD is active in the brain, it quiets that default mode network. And so when the default mode network goes down, that's when the ego goes down. You get ego dissolution when you get the default mode network going down. And so when the default mode network goes down, you get that ego dissolution. All these other areas of the brain are lit up and they're starting to connect and they're starting to communicate. And so this is connecting regions and pathways that normally don't communicate in the brain. And this can lead to weird things like synesthesia, where you can hear things and see sounds, things like that, which is obviously a pretty creative way to be viewing reality. And also it significantly increases just the global brain activity that's going on. So you get enhanced sensory processing, as well as you get these dramatic changes in thought patterns. And so when you think about all that going on in the brain with LSD, it's no wonder that it can lead to novel ways to see yourself, novel ways to see a problem, novel ways to see the world. And so you can see where that would really be able to obliterate the box, essentially, that you've been in and allow you to see much wider opportunities for creativity. And so I think what is going on in the brain, we do know, we don't have time to go into the importance of set and setting. I imagine you guys already know a good bit about that. But when you can create a scene in the brain like that, and it's in a positive set and setting, then that's when that's when the incredible stuff can happen. It can also be very scary if the set and setting's not right. But I think what is going on in the brain at this biochemical level is part of what stimulates these novel ideas and this creative process. So I love this quote by Timothy Leary. LSD is a drug that causes fear in those who don't take it. I love it. One of my favorite ones. And so it's interesting because when we start to shift, as LSD started to make it out of the laboratories out into the streets, artists started to get a hold of it, painters, writers, and especially musicians. And Stanford was running a lot of LSD experiments, and they actually, we found out later, were partially funded by the CIA. And this is where Ken Kesey, Robert Hunter, who was the lyricist for the Grateful Dead, this is where they first had their exposures to LSD. So Timothy Leary liked to say that the CIA was actually responsible for the creation of the counterculture. But these guys got in there and had these experiences, and then it managed to get out of the lab. And so people were taking it and using it. And this led to, like I said, anti-war protests, things like that, which definitely scared the government. So there was this complete backlash that shut it all down. And when it all got shut down, the thing was, the government back then in the mid-70s controlled the narrative. They controlled the radio, the television, the newspapers. The thing that's happening now, because I will tell you this decision to not approve MDMA in August, purely political. But the thing that's happening now that we're going to see, they do not control the narrative anymore. We have social media, we have the internet, we have all kinds of ways to be communicating, to where this old idea of shutting it down for the sake of the pharmaceutical companies or whatever, it's not going to work so great. Too many people know what's going on, and there's an access to good, objective information. There's also a lot of crazy shit on the internet and social media, but there's also the access to good information. So we're not going to see this total shutdown backlash thing that we saw back in the mid-70s. So we jump ahead to the Grateful Dead, who hung out at Ken Kesey's. Ken Kesey was famous for throwing the acid test. This happened this was about 1965, 66. The acid test didn't last that long, but this is where people could show up, pay $1. Everybody paid $1. The band, the janitor, everybody paid $1. And there was a huge trash can of LSD punch in the middle of the room. And people would go and imbibe. And the idea was to just be in this room with all these people. And the motto was to freak freely. And this is where the Grateful Dead was born. They showed up and put their instruments in, plugged them in, and they'd get high, and then they'd play for people. And they said it was wonderful because there was no expectations. If they didn't want to play, they didn't have to play. If they were too high, they could put their instruments down and walk off and hang out in the audience. But this is what essentially birthed the model of the Grateful Dead scene, was this idea of playing music that was steeped in LSD. It was born in LSD. It was written and developed on LSD. And it was played for people on LSD. And there was a synergy there between the music and the band, and there was a synergy between the band and the audience. And this created a very unique atmosphere that, honestly, if you went to a show in the 90s when Jerry was still alive, you would see and feel remnants of the acid test at these shows, because it was essentially a continuation and an evolution of this thing that really only blossomed for about a year in the Bay Area. But this was a way of taking it on and bringing it out into the world. And the interesting thing about the Grateful Dead and their music was they were already an amalgamation of different musical styles. Garcia was bluegrass and folk. Bill Kreutzmann, the drummer, came from a jazz background. Phil Lesh was orchestral and avant-garde music. Pigpen was a bluesman. Bob Weir was into jug band, folk music. So you had this mishmash of various types of American music. And then you throw LSD in there. And we know that what happened was, and if you read there's been a lot of books put out about the Grateful Dead over the years. I got about every single one of them right here. But one of the things that they said was LSD allowed them to access and create and communicate together this kind of music. They almost had a telepathy where they sort of knew what each other was going to play before they played it. And they were able to kind of foster and create this ability to communicate on the stage within the music. And that there was almost a telepathy that they said that they developed. And they did it so much early on, they found that they didn't have to take LSD later in their career. They had just developed the skill to be able to play this particular music and interact with each other in a particular way where they no longer really needed to be high on psychedelics. And if you also, let's not forget the power of psychedelic co-creation, because I do think when I saw 100 shows between 1985 and 1995 when Jerry died. That was it for me. I'm a purist. Yes, you can criticize me, but that was it for me. But one of the things that I loved was this idea that it was a safe place for people to be. And this music, Robert Hunter, because of his LSD background, his lyrics were mythical. They were archetypal, and they were drawn from diverse sources, and also from his own LSD experience, and also from Bob Dylan's influence, because Bob Dylan was the first one to try to put real intelligent lyrics into songs. And so there was an inspiration to be really intelligent, not just write about fast cars and chicks, but to be writing about things that really matter. And so they were diving into the unconscious and bringing all of this mythical type of archetypal imagery and putting it into their songs. And if you listen to their songs, sometimes, one of the things I had happen is I would listen to a song for 10 years and it would mean one thing. And then I'd go to a show and there would be something going on in my life, and this song would take on an entirely different meaning. And that's great art when you have multiple levels of meaning. But that was what was so great about their music, is that you could find meaning in these songs, and every song could be different, but it spoke to you. Another thing that's important to bring up as far as the Grateful Dead and the development of their culture was Owsley Stanley, who was their patron. And he was also one of the, if not the biggest LSD manufacturer in the United States. And there was a funny little chapter in 1968 when the band moved to LA temporarily, and Owsley set up his LSD pill manufacture operation in the house the band was staying in. So this machine upstairs is going chunk, 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 24 hours a day. They said pink dust was all over the house. Everybody was high on LSD constantly. They would be outside seeing spaceships, Sasquatch, and they continued to develop this music in this very high, open, psychedelic environment. And then let's not forget also that there was long improvisational passages. So it was kind of like where you had this loose structure of a song with the lyrics, but then there was wide open places where they could explore. And they would oftentimes talk about being able to read the vibe in the room and how people were feeling. And so a lot of that went into how this music got improvised and was played for other people. I do think that there was, because of this LSD with the band and their ability to design this music and play together, and this audience that showed up frequently very high on psychedelics, LSD, there was a kind of a give and take and a feedback loop that happened, which, you can say, yeah, that happens everywhere when you go to a concert, but there was something that was a little different there. The Dead used to talk about they could pick up and feed off the energy of the crowd could sit there and feed off the energy of the band, and it just became this thing that could grow into this beautiful, beautiful thing. I felt like it was a soundtrack for collective exploration and healing. It was my psychotherapy from 1985 to 95. I missed it, but I did some of my greatest exploration and growth, spiritual and psychological and emotional, at these shows. And I think if there's anybody out there listening to me right now that was at these shows, I think they would nod their head and say, heck yeah, there was definitely something going on that went beyond just, 6X hippies up there playing music. There was something else going on that at a much deeper level. Jerry Garcia is the patron saint of the Pearl Psychedelic Institute. I did want to say that. He's followed me around for years. I've had a picture of him in my office all these years. And so I do believe that these guys really were expressing whatever they were getting out of the LSD experience, out of those deep spaces, those deep collective, archetypal, mythical spaces. I think all of that is what came through in the music. It came through in the lyrics, and that's why it was so deep and it resonated so deeply with people. And again, the Deadheads, a population of derision from a lot of people, but there were people that would just go to every show. There was a little bit of this moth to the flame syndrome. There was something so magical about these shows. These people just devoted their life. It was all about getting to the next show, all about getting to the next show. I felt it. I never succumbed to it all the way, but I certainly knew why people did it. And it was this, it was a deeper lesson in learning how to go into the flow and to trust and to be open and to play. And what I always heard from people, they called them tour rats, but the folks that really lived on tour with these guys, it's like things just took care of itself. It was this trust in the process. And you would show up at a show and tickets would show up. Or if you ran out of gas, somebody would pull over and help you out. There was just this juju that they had discovered and grown and nurtured, that people were able able to come in and participate in. And so it was a really wonderful thing. And it went on for 30 years. And, it's still going on to a certain extent. I'm glad they're still playing so that folks that weren't able to see it back in the heyday can still kind of touch in with it and see what it was about. But it was truly an American thing, and it was very unique. And to this day, it's just some of my most magical memories in my life. And so it's always got a real soft spot in my heart for that stuff. So I'm watching the time, Jackie, so I'm going to try to wrap it up right now, I think. But I appreciate everybody paying attention to this. I think LSD it's an enigma. I don't think people understand quite what it does. Certainly people in power didn't understand it in the late 60s when they were trying to make sense of it. But there is actually studies opening up right now, and this is what I'll close with. There's a company out there that's made an LSD type molecule that's actually a little shorter acting, I think. And they just got done doing a study in the U.S. over 20 sites looking at treating generalized anxiety disorder with 100 microgram and 200 microgram doses. And the results were phenomenal as far as people being able to go a month or two. That's as far as they were looking at it, and having be symptom free after carrying around a generalized anxiety disorder for years. A lot of the research that's been happening has been in Switzerland, a lot of end of life stuff. And then a very interesting thing that I'll close out with, that's starting out in the Netherlands. One of Albert Hofmann's biggest disappointments, he said, was that when Sandoz yanked LSD and shut down all the studies, he had always had this intuitive idea that very low dose LSD would be an excellent treatment for ADHD. And there is a study opening up right now in the Netherlands where they are going to start to give 20 microgram doses like every 4 days or so to people, along with placebos, to start to test to see if low dose LSD, almost a little bit, microdose LSD is around 10. This is about twice of a microdose. And the idea is to see if it can go out and help people with ADHD. And I know telling American parents, here's some LSD for your kid to go to school on so they can pay attention. But when you think about what we're giving kids these days, amphetamines essentially, I'd probably rather have my kid on 10 or 20 mics of LSD than Ritalin. So I think I'll close it there. So thanks, Jackie. I appreciate you guys being here.
Thank you, Raymond. That was so fabulous. Look at, we got this has been signed purchase as applause. So we're going to open it up to some Q&A. So if you have a question, you can type it in the chat. You can raise your virtual hand and I'll call on you. Let me put it in a view so I can see you. But one of the questions that came up in the chat, where did it go? I think someone was asking about the, being in that zone. And this is our focus has been on LSD, but their question is are there other ways we can do that?
You mean without taking a psychedelic or without taking LSD?
Without taking it. Well, maybe you can answer both. I'm not sure what they meant.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I think there's all kinds of ways to sharpen our focus and to sharpen our minds and to clear ourselves out so that we can be more open to unique ideas and creativity. Meditation. Obviously, yoga, I think. My thing I used to do, when I was going, when I was at the end of my rope, is I would just get out in the woods all day, take a hike by myself. That was a nice reset as well. And it just kind of, nature's inherently balanced. It's not judging me. You can get out there and just be yourself and just be in it. And I think because it's inherently balanced, it sort of comes in and helps balance the physiology in the organism. So I think yoga, meditation, even things like exercise, long distance running, I think these are all things that can help sharpen focus. I'm a big fan of throughout the day, when I can think about it, just take 3 minutes and shut everything down. Close my eyes, do some nice deep breathing. It's not going to make me late for anything. It's not going to keep me from getting to what I get to that day, but it's taking 3 to 5 minutes and just stopping. Mm-hmm. And allowing everything to settle. And I have found when I do that, I get all kinds of inspirations for that too. Things that I've been so busy I'm not allowing in. If I can stop for 5 minutes, it allows some of this stuff to come in, which can be very helpful. So I'm not sure that answered the question, but that's kind of the top of my head answer to that, about non-drug ways to sort of get that same creativity focus thing.
Yeah, non-ordinary. There's lots of ways to get into non-ordinary states, but
absolutely,
psychedelics are just super fast and big.
Yeah.
Nate asked earlier, you were talking about, he asked this before you talked about this sort of telepathic experience that the dead would get into. And he asks if there's any research on any of it or influences on parapsychology research.
There was one very interesting experiment that I think was done in 1971 with the Grateful Dead. There was a psychologist named Stanley Krippner who was he's still alive. I think he's in his 90s. He was very interested in this whole parapsychology ESP thing. And so he designed a study where he had this guy named Malcolm Besant, who was sort of this medium back in the early 70s. And he planted him miles and miles away at this place called the Maimonides Dream Center. And then Stan went to a Grateful Dead show that was happening at I think it was the Capitol Theater maybe. And he knew everybody in the audience was going to be high on LSD. And so what he did was he went out to the audience and he said, we're going to do a little experiment throughout the show. During the show, we're going to be putting up big pictures, like a big picture behind the band. And what we'd like you to do is when one of those pictures shows up, we want everybody, as much as you can, focus on that image and imagine sending it to this guy who's, miles and miles away, but see what you can do to transmit that image. And the experiment was the experiment was a success. It wasn't like 100%. I know if you guys are watching the telepathy tapes that are kind of big on podcasts right now, those kids are hitting it 100%. This guy wasn't 100%, but he was probably like 60 or 70. But he was a guy that was sitting there with absolutely no cues, and he would get these images showing up. But that's the only one I know of that sort of used LSD as in that way, and also involved the Grateful Dead. But it was people that were high on LSD, dancing to this music, seeing this image, and then in their minds trying to transmit this image to this guy. So that's the one that comes to mind to me.
That's awesome. I love it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's cool.
Richard asks, can you differentiate your experience among LSD, mushrooms, and MDMA?
I can. LSD is... Okay, psilocybin mushrooms was the first psychedelic I took. I was 19 years old, sophomore at the University of Georgia. I was an advertising major. I felt like I needed to go make tons of money, and I was kind of creative, and that's how I was going to do it. And these things came in, and I saw myself at the top of my game in my 50s, at the top of the advertising world, in a huge office with artwork and the little brandy snifter, whatever on this, at the top of my game. And I felt this existential emptiness. And I had this thought, what are you doing, dude? What are you going to do? You're going to spend the rest of your life convincing people to buy a bunch of stuff they don't need? What are you doing? And I was like, what am I doing? And I thought, where is this coming from? This isn't coming from the mushrooms. This is coming from somewhere in me. And it helped reach this truer aspect of myself that I had been kind of been socialized out of me from just sort of my upbringing. So that was the most powerful, to this day, one of the most powerful psychedelic experiences I ever had. So that definitely set me off on the mushroom path. And I'd read Timothy Leary's Flashbacks, and that had kind of got me interested in them. But what I find is mushrooms and LSD are very similar in the sense that they shut down the default mode network and they bring all these other areas of the brain online. And so that's how they're similar. But to me, the similarity kind of stops there. I find mushrooms to be much more about earthy wisdom, deep body stuff. I feel things in my body. There's more of an emotional quality sometimes to psilocybin. I also find, at least in my experiences, it was the diciest of the psychedelics. I really had to be careful who I was doing it with, where I was doing it. All of these factors seem to be much more important to me. If I've had any really difficult trips in my life, and I've had a handful of them, most of them have been mushrooms. And so I have a deep respect for those things. And I also don't play around, man. I know that they it's almost like you're interacting with an intelligence, like this plant intelligence. LSD is a little different, although we have essentially some of the same stuff happening in the brain. To me, phenomenologically, to me, it's a much more, and people may argue with this, to me, it's a much more intellectual type of thing. I'm up in my head. Ideas are coming. Associations are showing up. Things that I may not have ever connected are coming together and showing up. Visually, I think both of those are very similar. The breathing walls or whatever however you might want to see it. But I think visually, LSD and psilocybin can be very similar. But I do think psilocybin in general is just a little more earthy, a little more earth tone as far as the visuals and things go. Whereas LSD is much more bright, much more emphatic. And it's just a much faster, it's kind of like an amusement park in your head. You're on the ride. And I tell people with it, same thing with ketamine when we're working on it. I tell people it's like you're getting in the roller coaster. The safety bar is going to close and lock, and you are on the ride. You're on the ride till it's over. You're not getting off of it. And so you really need to kind of be prepared for these things and paying attention to things like set and setting. But those are the two biggest differences I found with psilocybin mushrooms and LSD. I've gotten enormous benefits from both. I know when I went to Grateful Dead shows, typically LSD was, but if you were going to 3 shows, we got good at this too. If you were going to 3 shows in 3 days, even though there's a little cross tolerance, we would typically take like a nice little dose of LSD the first night. Second night, we'd take mushrooms. Third night, all out with LSD. And so you ended up having 3 good nights of feeling like you're kind of riding this wave. And I always found that the first show was about sifting through all the psychological, emotional garbage that I had accumulated since the last show and getting rid of it. And then the second night was all about getting back in touch with myself. It was almost like taking a values survey and what is really important to me and what do I really need to be focusing on. And then the third night, almost inevitably, was just this feeling of, man, your life is an open book. You can do whatever you want to do. It's just a matter of finding your passion and being able to put the energy and do the work. And you can really have anything you want. And it was a very valuable lesson. I take that template with me out into the world. It was just something that taught me just incredible lessons. And then briefly, MDMA, I'll tell about this because you asked. It's a very different one. MDMA does not react in the brain at all. It doesn't mess with the default mode network. Essentially, and this is what makes it such a great trauma medicine, what it does is it shuts down the amygdala 95%. The amygdala is the fight or flight reaction. And when fight or flight in trauma people, if you can shut down the fight or flight, it allows all this fragmented, highly charged, buried trauma memories to surface. And because the amygdala is shut down, you're not freaking out. You're able to sort of be with it. The other thing it does is it hyperactivates a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And this is where a lot of your higher order processing is taking place. You're categorizing your experience. You're assigning language to it so that it can even be encoded as a long-term memory. And all that higher order processing goes offline during trauma because you're in survival mode. And so it's not only releasing the trauma memories, it's giving you a place where you can sit with it. And it's also firing up all the brain mechanisms that should have been happening at the time of the trauma that weren't because you were so freaked out about dying or being hurt. And so there's also a couple of hormones that are released, oxytocin and prolactin, which are deep empathy hormones, deep relaxation hormones. And so you've got a very different thing going on in the brain. Not that people can't have psychedelic experiences. One of the things that really surprised me in the expanded access work we did was you don't think of MDMA being a very visual psychedelic. But these people that we had, these 4 patients we treated that were under the eye shades, were coming out with these very vivid visual representations of what was going on in their healing. And it was incredibly beautiful and moving. I wish I could tell you guys some stories. I am doing a webinar on MDMA-assisted therapy that I'm going to be rolling out in early April. So Jackie, I would love it if you could share the link for that. But I'm going to go into a lot more in deep dive into MDMA, the history and what we saw and some of the stories that we saw in expanded access. But to answer your question, that's kind of the way personally I've experienced those 3 psychedelics and their differences.
Awesome. Oh, this is so great. It's so great to listen to you and to hear the stories in all of the realms. And we are at our time, and I want to honor that. So just a big round of thank yous to Raymond for showing up and for all of the wisdom and expertise and experience that you bring to this conversation tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.